Hi everyone, it's Emily. I'm going to be doing my analysis on embodying integration, chapter 4, part 2. So let's get on into it. The key message that I obtained from this reading primarily pertains to the therapist's approach to confronting their client's darkness with referencing atonement. Still discusses the themes of atonement through this. Throughout the second half of the chapter, the author intentionally includes Megan, Anna, and Mark's approaches to the client's to a specific client's sin or stuff that they've been personally dealing with. Mark failed to realize the love of the person despite living in a muddled world in which he rejected his clients. He didn't really necessarily reject the client's story, but he did reference the client to another therapist because it was just very hard for him to kind of establish that boundary between therapist and client because of the strong feelings that he had towards Richard's affair during his marriage. As for Megan Anna, she was having difficulty navigating her woundedness while engaging with her clients, and actually it was very important for her to navigate that because the client's woundedness with hers could overlap, and it brings more complexity upon the healing process and finding God amidst that pain for both the client and the therapist. I also liked her story because the emphasis as well as reminding us that it's okay for therapists to receive help as well when they are going through their own woundedness. I feel like that isn't really discussed a lot. And it should be normalized that everyone should receive therapy to grow psychologically and spiritually, and that was a major point that was highlighted, that these two factors, psychology and theology, are intertwined and they kind of affect each other. For my favorite point, I really like Mark's story with Richard, even though he did reject him. And while reading this, I was just shaking my head this is not a good thing for him to do, because if I was Richard, I would feel like I was devalued, and since I'm lacking self-appreciation, I feel like a therapist rejecting my story would just feel super invalidating. But despite that, Mark eventually learned from his mistakes and regretted referring him to another therapist, which I actually really like that he included this aspect of going through this and then what he learned. And it seemed like he learned a lot. Mark learned that if he had a more flexible view of atonement, it might have allowed him to experience Richard's sin differently. Because Mark identifies himself as a Christian therapist, I feel like this would have made the connection that I feel like he should have made that connection that God isn't a rejecting God, and he doesn't reject those who have sinned, but chooses to embrace them with empathy and compassion. And I just feel like it was really interesting how Mark didn't really realize that, and I wonder if this has to do more about some personal stuff he's going through, or just the fact that he just didn't approve of Richard's decisions. But yeah, God chooses to embrace people that have sin with empathy and compassion and waits for them amidst the darkness that they are experiencing. Despite this, though, I still find it amazing how Mark's reflection with atonement, with his atonement lens, allowed him to see his faults, due to the fact that psychology affects theology and vice versa. It seems like both Richard and Mark needed reminders of the theme of atonement, and that the fact that God's enduring love is met at the cross that Jesus died for our sins on. And unfortunately it was too late for them to be introduced to that simultaneously, but it was a great story regardless. Do I agree with the author's perspective? Actually, there was a lot of points in this chapter that provided clarification on thoughts that I had last week, in terms of why atonement doesn't really focus on the Old Testament, and that's primarily because it does focus on Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. However, the metaphor aspect still kind of tingles me a little bit, but I still, yeah, it just like, there's a lot of connected points from this chapter that we've discussed previously in this class. For example, being reminded of living in a broken world and that our sin doesn't necessarily define who we are, as well as being an empathetic presence in therapy, which is something that Mark actually lacked. Instead, he was kind of like judgmental towards Richard's actions, but he did overcome that. But that just really proves how it's important to be empathetic with your client, regardless of what sin they may have committed. And how our faith is defined relationally. That subject was touched on a bit. And a concept that I really liked is that Christian therapists are more concerned about the patient's experience of God that develops into psychological and spiritual suffering versus being more concerned about the accuracy of their perception. I feel like this is just really important, that shows like a more empathetic lens towards the client finding atonement. But yeah. How does this information relate to your own experiences and beliefs? The author emphasizes that God doesn't make sense of suffering, or all suffering. He may make sense of some suffering, but not all, and that suffering can never fully be understood. And I feel like this is just a very personal thing that I've experienced, where sometimes I can't get out of the suffering that I've been feeling for a long time. And even though God can make sense of some suffering, it's okay, and it's important to be accepting the fact that like we're not going to get all the answers, and that kind of ties back into a topic that we discussed, and the fact that our suffering can never be fully understood because there's just so many areas to be covered with it, and just sometimes it leads to a lot of emotional scarring that just like never heals, but it's just important to be accepting of that fact. And then what question would I pose to a larger group? This was one of the integration conversation starters, but I would just ask, how would you respond to suffering in the world and what's going on right now? And just like how you can have a more empathetic lens towards like maybe others people's suffering versus being so caught up in your own. Like for example, like Richard and Mark's story, and that whole dynamic. So yeah.